Harold hummed along to Mozart, meticulously buttering his toast. Tuesday, toast day, life was good, predictable. Then the email arrived. Subject line, your upcoming departure. Harold nearly choked on his toast. Departure? He wasn't going anywhere except perhaps to the supermarket later. He clicked the email open. It was short, to the point, and utterly absurd. According to the message, his life expectancy had been, shall we say, revised. He had precisely 7 days left to live. Harold reread the email. No, it definitely wasn't a scam. It had the official Afterlife team logo, a golden halo with a feather quill tucked behind it. The email even had a personalized footer. Remember, Harold, death is just the beginning. Of paperwork. Charming. He nearly missed the postscript. P.S. Please disregard if you have received this email in error. Harold frowned. An error? As if they were talking about a misdirected package, not the end of his existence. Harold, a man of routine, decided the only sensible course of action was to reply. He composed a carefully worded email, polite yet firm. He pointed out that a week's notice was simply not enough. What about his stamp collection, his unread books, and who would water his prize-winning begonias? He requested, with utmost respect for the hereafter and its scheduling conflicts, a reasonable extension, perhaps a month, or at the very least, until after the annual village bake-off. His Victoria sponge cake was legendary. Harold clicked send, a strange sense of calm washing over him. He'd done what he could. He finished his toast, the crunch oddly comforting in the face of impending doom. He decided a second cup of tea was in order. After all, he had a busy week ahead of him, living and dying and all that. The reply from the Afterlife team arrived promptly the next morning. It was an automated response, which Harold found rather impersonal given the circumstances. The email informed him that his request for an extension was being processed under case number #deceased 2024-10 Harold 42. It also included a helpful FAQ section with questions such as what to expect when you're expecting, the afterlife, and can I bring my pets? Answer only goldfish due to interdimensional travel restrictions. Harold skimmed through the FAQ, chuckling at the absurdity of it all. Dying was one thing, but dealing with heavenly bureaucracy, that was truly terrifying. He learned that he would be assigned a personal reaper who would guide him through the transition process. He was also given the option to choose his preferred afterlife experience: cloud surfing, celestial choir practice, or the ever-popular eternal slumber package. Harold found the whole thing rather overwhelming. He decided to put the afterlife planning on hold and focus on something a bit more manageable, like finishing the crossword puzzle. With his impending demise looming, Harold decided to shake things up. He ate sardines for breakfast, a lifelong curiosity never indulged, wore mismatched socks with a flourish, and finally told Mrs. Peabody next door what he really thought of her yappy chihuahua. It involved the phrase, pocket-sized gremlin. He dug out his old record player, dusted off his vinyl collection, and filled his days with the soaring melodies of Beethoven and Brahms. He even signed up for a beginner's pottery class, though he suspected his chances of becoming the next Michelangelo were slim, given the time constraints. His life, normally a symphony of routine, had become a delightful, if slightly macabre, improvisation. He felt oddly liberated, free from the mundane worries that usually plagued him. After all, what did it matter if he spilled coffee on his shirt when he had a limited supply of shirts left to wear? He embraced the chaos, the unexpected joy of living each day as if it were his last, because, well, it technically was. The days flew by in a blur of activity and sardine breath. Harold crossed off items on his bucket list with gusto. He ate an entire cheesecake in one sitting, regretted it, but hey, YOLO, went skinny dipping in the village pond at midnight, much to the consternation of a family of ducks, and even tried skydiving twice, because once wasn't nearly terrifying enough. By day 6, however, a strange sense of anticipation settled over him. He found himself checking his watch every other minute, wondering when exactly the Grim Reaper made his rounds. Did they have a specific schedule, or did they just pop in when the mood struck? He hoped his assigned Reaper wasn't one for theatrics. He'd hate to go out with a bang, or worse, a puff of smoke. As the sun began to set on his last day, Harold found himself sitting by the window, nursing a cup of chamomile tea. He felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He'd lived a good life, a quiet life, but a good one nonetheless. He'd made his peace with the world, even with Mrs. Peabody's chihuahua, though he still maintained the pocket-sized gremlin classification was accurate. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and waited. The clock ticked past midnight. Still alive. Harold raised an eyebrow. Had he outwitted the afterlife? Just then, an email arrived. Subject: important update regarding your departure. Harold nearly choked on his chamomile tea. The email apologized for any inconvenience caused, but it appeared there had been a slight delay. It seemed the afterlife department was undergoing a rather extensive restructuring process. They were outsourcing, apparently. Harold stared at the email, a strange mix of relief and indignation bubbling inside him. Outsourcing. At a time like this, he'd been prepared to die to face the unknown. He'd even picked out a rather fetching shroud. Now what? He was stuck in this strange limbo, technically dead, but still very much alive. He sighed. He supposed he could make another cup of tea, and perhaps finally tackle that stack of unread books. After all, what was eternity without a good book? The next morning dawned bright and sunny, mockingly cheerful in light of Harold's existential predicament. He decided to treat the unexpected extension as a bonus round, a chance to savour the little things he'd almost taken for granted. He took long walks in the park, marvelling at the intricate patterns of leaves on the ground. He spent afternoons in cosy cafes, indulging in pastries and people-watching. He even struck up a conversation with the barista, a young woman with a quirky collection of vintage hats. He learned her name was Emily, and she dreamed of opening her own bakery one day. Harold found himself sharing his story, his impending death-turned-indefinite postponement with Emily. She listened with wide eyes, then burst into laughter. "Only you, Harold," she said, shaking her head. "Only you would get stood up by the Grim Reaper." Her laughter was infectious, and soon Harold found himself laughing along with her. It was absurd, ridiculous, and utterly delightful. As the days turned into weeks, Harold settled back into a routine, albeit one with a newfound appreciation for the absurdity of it all. He still received the occasional email from the afterlife team, usually updates on their restructuring process, or apologies for the delay. He'd even started replying with helpful suggestions, mostly regarding their customer service and the lack of comfortable seating in their waiting areas. He assumed there were waiting areas, afterlife bureaucracy being what it was. He often thought about his near-death experience, about how close he'd come to the unknown. It hadn't made him less afraid of dying, not really, but it had made him more aware of living. He paid attention to the small details, the way sunlight danced on the surface of his teacup, the soothing rhythm of his own heartbeat. He savoured each bite of food, each shared laugh, each moment of quiet contemplation. Harold decided to revisit his bucket list. Some items, like swim with dolphins and learn to play the ukulele, still held appeal. Others, like tell off that rude supermarket cashier — he'd since discovered she was a single mother working 2 jobs — and dye my hair neon green. He'd tried it. It clashed terribly with his complexion, no longer seemed quite as important. He realized that what he really wanted wasn't to fill his days with grand adventures, but to savor the ordinary moments that made up a life well lived. He started baking again, his kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of cinnamon and sugar. He joined the local book club, where he engaged in lively debates about literature and life with a group of like-minded individuals. He even volunteered at the local animal shelter, finding solace in the unconditional love of furry companions. Life, it seemed, was full of second chances, even if they came with a side of cosmic red tape. Harold never did receive that revised itinerary from the afterlife team. Perhaps his file got lost in the interdimensional shuffle, or maybe his designated reaper had developed a sudden case of cold feet. Whatever the reason, Harold had stopped checking his inbox with bated breath. He'd learned to embrace the absurdity of it all, the unexpected gift of borrowed time. He lived each day with a twinkle in his eye and a song in his heart, knowing that life was a precious and unpredictable journey, even when navigated with the help of a slightly incompetent afterlife department. So, here's to Harold, a man who stared death in the face and blinked, who found humor in the face of the unknown, and who taught us all that sometimes the best things in life are the unexpected detours, the unscheduled adventures, and the moments of quiet grace that make up the extraordinary tapestry of being alive. Cheers to Harold, and cheers to the glorious, messy, utterly unpredictable ride that is life.